And there's actually an interesting segue here, because all of your organizations that were founded over a decade ago, and probably in communities where the whole gentrification or revitalization effort hadn't really taken off, and I'm sure real estate property values have gone out of sight in all of your communities. Is it possible for an organization starting up right now to do the work that you did, given the high cost of acquiring property, do you think? And do you see that as a barrier for the continuation of your own work in your communities?
It may be a barrier, but it's one we have to overcome. Frankly, in Williamsburg, Greenpoint, when I mentioned the development of housing, almost all that property was developed either on church-owned land or on city-owned land. And that was an enormous asset. I think in those days we didn't appreciate how much of an asset that was. Because if you had a piece of tax foreclosed property, the city was willing to sell it to you for $1, and then you could readily find resources to renovate that building and have it reoccupied. But today, we're competing against literally an army of developers with suitcases full of cash that are determining property values, not at the rental market level, but at the highest dollar value for luxury condos that can be found in our community. And that's where, in Williamsburg, our heads are still spinning. Luxury condos can be going for a 2-bedroom for up to $1 million. And that's driving all of the real estate values. So it's an enormous challenge for us, one we're determined to overcome. We are continuing to work with our church partners and talk to them about development of some properties, but frankly we feel that the future really requires that we figure out a way to overcome that. Now our intermediaries, LISC, Enterprise, HPD, many of the banks have formed an investment fund providing in excess of $1 million, $10 million I think, to help us acquire properties. So we're out there now trying to figure out how to make that work. So we're still building on some tax foreclosed, on some property we own, and we're talking to other partners that would help us to build. But frankly, the future is really how do we be able to compete against the private market in trying to acquire land.
Now, Lucille, you have a project that you're working on right now. Is that being funded under the investment fund, or is that you looking?
On West 146th Street, there is a site that has been part of the Bradhurst Urban Renewal Plan for 20 years and hasn't been redeveloped because it is a former brownfield site, being a previous film storage warehouse. And the difficulties with redevelopment have been there's a projected cost of cleanup for the site of more than $1 million. And we were locked out of the state's brownfields cleanup program. And to HDCI, this was pretty amazing because we were one of the study cases that was presented in the passage of the law. But then this site was. And then when the law was passed, it wasn't as carefully constructed as it should have been, which often happens with well-intentioned laws. They don't quite hit the mark. And so to close a loophole that allowed so much expense for buildings like the new New York Times building, they said sites that had historic fill would be ineligible. And historic fill is from, long time ago when they would fill in sites with stuff from anywhere and everywhere prior to building a building on top. And so that's the case with this site, and therefore the site is ineligible. And we've been lobbying for well over a year to try and get the site into the program. The change in the law wasn't actually in the law, it was by regulation by the agency, so we are hopeful. We started out with that site to build an office where we would have an office home, because right now we're spread up and down 8th Avenue at 9 different locations, which is pretty much an administrative nightmare. But we wanted to move into one location and move several offices together. And it's been very difficult because of that hurdle for cleanup funds, number one. And number two, anytime you're doing a site that's a little different, like just to build office space, I think Sheena could probably address that because they moved to a new location. And even moving into an existing building, I'm sure you had some fun cobbling together monies to do so. And then we want to build senior housing above. And while, you know, there is so much support and talk about support for our seniors, as it is support for our children, we're also trying to do a standalone child care center. And both of those projects have been our two most difficult projects to fund. So unless you're doing what fits into the standard mold of affordable housing for families, average two-bedroom apartments within your building, it's much more difficult to find money.
Sheena, have you found barriers to finding new sites for development, or are you finding any more difficult properties that developers can't seem to make that profit on?
Absolutely. I mean, everything is more difficult. As Mike pointed out, the barriers to entry are humongous. I mean, this is where you really need a lot of faith. As I said, these institutions were founded on city-owned land and church-owned land, and that was the genesis. There is no more city-owned land. And the property values in Harlem, like Williamsburg, and everywhere else in New York City are just outrageous. So it's very challenging. But one of the interesting things is that faith-based institutions actually do own property. It's the parking lots where people park their cars, which are just, you know, can be re-envisioned with putting the parking underneath and housing or senior facilities or something else on top. But you do have to have that vision, and as Mike said, we can overcome it if we are creative enough. There are still opportunities to create what we've been talking about. We have been doing it's like kind of like a hodgepodge. You'll see a city-owned site next to a privately owned site, and have to pay market value for the privately owned site and find resources for it. But if you can get the city site for $1, it makes the acquisitions cost much less. We have a major project right now in the 3 blocks that surround the church, where we're going to be building 200 units of housing, a new facility for our elementary school, about a 60,000 square foot school, a cultural space, and this is actually on land that we already own, and the old Renaissance ballroom, which will be a new cultural ballroom event place, as well as commercial space, and the 3 blocks that surround the church. So it's a major project and initiative. It is very challenging and difficult to piece together all the subsidies and resources to make it work. We get money from our borough president. We get money from our city council. We're raising funds for foundations, from corporations, resources from the city. But you have to be very creative. You have to be sophisticated enough, and that means really going out and getting the experts that are going to help you piece it all together to make it work. Because one thing out of balance can sink the whole thing. You know, if you can't get like plugged into the brown sewers legislation, or if you can't get the right subsidy you need for the housing, or if you can't get the designation from landmarks for your building, it can just destroy everything. So you have to have really a wide array of professionals and experts that can really help and guide this very, very complicated process.